My grandfather said one sentence before he died, and it destroyed this whole family. Money always reveals character. At that time, I did not fully understand what he meant. I was standing in his mansion, in the middle of a silent storm, watching the people who were supposed to love him most slowly turn into strangers. And by the end of that night, I learned something I will never forget. Wealth does not create character. It only exposes it. My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how I watched a rich family fight over inheritance, lie to each other, and lose the one man who actually loved them. It started in the summer my grandfather, Richard Carter, got sick. He was not just rich. He was the kind of man people whispered about in restaurants. He owned companies, land, buildings, and more money than any normal person could count. But to me, before all the money, he was just Grandpa. He used to smell like old books and clean wood polish. He used to sit with me on the back porch and teach me how to play chess. He used to tell me that a man's name is worth more than his bank account. That summer, though, everything changed. He became weak. His hands shook. He could not walk without help. And the moment the family heard he was sick, they started showing up like vultures circling a body. My aunt, Melissa, came first. She wore expensive clothes, fake sadness, and a voice so sweet it felt like syrup poured over poison. Then came my Uncle Brandon, who smiled too much and kept asking too many questions about the companies and property. Then came my father's older brother, Thomas, who had not visited Grandpa in years, but suddenly acted like he had been the most devoted son in the world. And of course, they all brought gifts. A fruit basket nobody ate. A medicine box nobody needed. Flowers meant for display, not comfort. But I saw through them. Because when people are greedy, they think they are being clever. They always forget that sick old men have lived long enough to recognize fake love. I was 22 at the time, working part-time while finishing college. I had always been the quiet one in the family, the one people ignored. I was not rich. I was not powerful. I did not have a suit, a business card, or a polished smile. But Grandpa trusted me. He asked me to stay with him during the day, when the others were too busy handling family matters. I did not know then that those family matters were really about taking his money before he even died. The first thing I noticed was the way they talked in the hallways when they thought nobody could hear them. One evening, I was bringing tea to Grandpa's room when I heard Melissa speaking in the living room. Her voice was low, sharp, and cold. "If the doctors say he's not improving, we should move faster," she said. Brandon answered. "The trust papers need to be updated." Dad's confused. "We can get him to sign almost anything right now." Thomas gave a quiet laugh. "By the time he realizes what's happening, it will already be done." I stopped walking. My hand was shaking so hard that the tea almost slipped from the tray. They were talking about him. About Grandpa. About the man who had built everything they enjoyed. I wanted to walk in and scream at them. I wanted to throw the tray across the room and say their names out loud so the walls would remember their shame. But I did not, because Grandpa opened his bedroom door and looked right at me. He saw my face. He knew. He gave a very small shake of his head, like he was saying, "Not yet." I lowered the tray and walked into his room. He was sitting near the window, pale and tired, but his eyes were still sharp. He looked at me and said, "You heard them." It was not a question. I swallowed hard. "Yes, Grandpa." He nodded once. "Good." That confused me. "Good?" I asked. He leaned back slowly. "Now you know what kind of world you are in." I sat beside him. "Why are they doing this to you?" He looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "Because money tests people in ways comfort never does." "I did not say anything," he continued. "When everything is easy, anyone can look kind, anyone can act loyal. But when there is something to fight over, the truth comes out." His voice was weak, but the words were heavy. Then he turned to me and said, "Daniel, I need you to be careful." About what? About everyone. That night, I went to bed with a knot in my stomach. The next morning, the family gathered in the dining room like a council of wolves, pretending to be relatives. Grandpa came in with his cane, and everyone instantly changed their expressions. Melissa rushed to pull out his chair. Brandon asked if he wanted water. Thomas said he looked much stronger today. It was all fake. Grandpa sat down and looked at each of them one by one. Then he said, "I want this family to stop lying to me." The room went silent. Melissa laughed softly. The way people do when they want to hide fear. "What are you talking about, Dad?" He did not answer right away. He reached for the glass of water, took a small sip, and placed it down carefully. Then he said, "I know some of you have been speaking to my lawyer without my permission." Nobody moved. "I know," he continued, "that some of you have been asking about my will." Brandon's face tightened. "I know," Grandpa said, "that you have been watching me like a clock waiting to stop." The room felt colder. Melissa's smile disappeared. "Dad, that is not fair." "No," he said. "What is not fair is pretending to care for a man while you count the money he leaves behind." Nobody answered. I was standing near the wall, too stunned to speak. Then Grandpa looked at me. "Daniel," he said, "bring me the folder from my study." I hurried to get it. When I returned, he opened it in front of everyone. Inside were papers, notes, and documents. He placed one hand on the table and said, "I have spent the last 3 weeks watching all of you." Thomas frowned. "Watching us?" "Yes." Brandon leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," Grandpa said, "that I had my own people look into certain conversations, certain meetings, and certain bank requests." The room froze. Melissa's eyes widened. Grandpa turned to her first. "You told your husband that if I died soon, you could finally sell the lake house." Then he looked at Brandon. "You asked a financial advisor how quickly assets could be shifted out of a trust." Then he looked at Thomas. "You tried to find out whether a power of attorney could be challenged while I was still alive." Nobody spoke. I felt like the floor had dropped under me. Grandpa folded his hands. "And all of you," he said, "came here smiling like you loved me." Melissa stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "How dare you spy on us?" Grandpa's eyes stayed calm. "How dare you plan on burying me before I was dead?" Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she looked guilty. Brandon tried a different approach. He softened his tone. "Dad, we were only worried about the future. You're sick. We thought—" "You thought about yourselves," Grandpa cut in. Thomas slammed his hand lightly on the table. "This is ridiculous. You're paranoid." Grandpa stared at him. "No," he said. "I am dying. I am not paranoid. There is a difference." That line hit the room like thunder. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then Grandpa did something nobody expected. He turned to the lawyer sitting quietly at the end of the room and said, "Read the amended will." Melissa gasped. "Amended will?" Brandon looked confused. "What amended will?" The lawyer opened the folder. Grandpa's face stayed still. He said, "Before you all started circling, I made my decision." The lawyer began to read. Most of the wealth would remain in trust. The houses would not be divided immediately. The company's shares would not go to the loudest mouths in the room. The main inheritance would go to a foundation for education, hospitals, and struggling families. And then came the part that made the family lose their minds. A significant portion of Grandpa's personal property and remaining authority over the estate would go to one person. Me, Daniel Carter, the quiet grandson, the one who never asked for a cent, the one who took his medicine to him, the one who sat by his bed, the one they all treated like a child. Melissa stared at Grandpa like she had never seen him before. "Why him?" she whispered. Grandpa answered without blinking. "Because he is the only one in this room who never asked what I was worth." Nobody spoke. Brandon looked at me with open hatred. Thomas looked almost sick. Melissa's voice rose. He is not qualified. He has no business experience. Grandpa's reply was calm and deadly. No, Melissa. He has something more valuable. He has character. That word hung in the air. Character. The one thing money cannot buy. The one thing greed destroys. The family exploded. Brandon started arguing about fairness. Thomas said Grandpa must be confused. Melissa began crying, but there was no truth in her tears. It was the kind of crying people do when they lose access, not love. I stood there feeling dizzy. I did not want the money. I did not want the war. I only wanted my grandfather to be healthy again. But the room had already changed. The inheritance was no longer a future thing. It had become a battlefield. After that meeting, the family stopped pretending. The warm smiles disappeared. The polite greetings vanished. Every conversation felt like an attack hidden under soft words. Melissa began visiting Grandpa's room more often, but now I noticed she always carried papers. Brandon suddenly wanted to help with medication schedules. Thomas started offering to manage phone calls and documents. Each of them was trying to get close to him. Each of them wanted control, and each of them thought he was too weak to notice. But Grandpa noticed everything. One afternoon, I found him sitting alone in his room, looking at an old photograph. It was a picture of him and Grandma at the beach, young and laughing, before the wealth, before the mansion, before the family became a business. I sat beside him. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. He kept looking at the photo. "Regret what?" "All of it. The money, the company, the family." He was silent for a while. Then he said, "No, money is not the problem, Daniel. People are." I looked at him. He smiled a little, but it was a sad smile. "I built a lot," he said, "but I did not raise them to be grateful. I raised them to expect." That sentence stayed with me. He set the picture down and looked at me. "You know what hurts the most?" I shook my head. "Not that they want the money," he said. "It is that they stopped seeing me as a person once the money became visible." His eyes glistened then, just a little. That was the first time I saw him look truly broken. Not from illness, from disappointment. A few days later, I found proof that the family was trying to move against him. I was going through paperwork for Grandpa when I found a set of copied documents in Brandon's folder. There were bank requests, trust notes, and a draft letter suggesting Grandpa was mentally unfit. My hands went cold. They were preparing to declare him incapable. That meant, if they succeeded, they could take control before he even died. I walked straight to Grandpa's room and showed him everything. He read it carefully. Then he handed the papers back to me with steady hands. "So," he said, "they've chosen the ugly path. What do we do?" I asked. He leaned back in the chair. "We tell the truth." That evening, he called the whole family into the main hall. The air inside that mansion felt heavy enough to suffocate. All the chandeliers, the marble floors, the expensive furniture, it all looked fake now. Just a beautiful cage for ugly people. Grandpa sat in his chair at the front of the room. Melissa stood with her arms folded. Brandon kept shifting his weight. Thomas looked annoyed, like the truth was an inconvenience. Grandpa held up the papers. "I know what you did." Nobody responded. "You planned to question my mind. You planned to gain access to the estate before I was gone. You planned to turn my illness into your opportunity." Melissa's voice was icy. "We were protecting the family." Grandpa laughed once. It was a dry, tired laugh. "No, you were protecting your greed." Then he looked at all of them. "I did not spend 50 years building a life so you could tear it apart in 1 month." Brandon stepped forward. "You're making this personal." "It is personal," Grandpa said. "You made it personal when you treated me like an object instead of your father." Thomas shook his head. "You've always trusted him more," he said, pointing at me. "That's the real problem." The room turned toward me. I felt my face burn. Grandpa looked at Thomas and said, "Yes, I trust Daniel more, because he never tried to own me. Nobody had a reply for that. And then Grandpa did something I still think about all the time. He asked each of them one simple question. If I had no money, would you still be here? Silence. Not one of them answered. Not one. That silence was louder than any scream. Grandpa nodded slowly, like he already knew the answer. Then he said, "That is all I needed to know." The next week was painful. The family fought. Lawyers came and went. Voices rose behind closed doors. There were threats, accusations, and crying at strange hours. Melissa accused me of manipulating Grandpa. Brandon said I was taking advantage of an old man. Thomas tried to convince everyone to challenge the will, but Grandpa stayed calm. He had already made peace with the truth. One evening, he called me into his room alone. The sun was setting outside the window, turning the whole sky gold. He asked me to sit down. Then he handed me a small envelope. "What is this?" I asked. "My final letter," he said. I swallowed hard. He continued, "When I am gone, do not let them turn my death into another fight for attention." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Open it only after the funeral." "I will." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Daniel, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Do not let money change you." That was the moment I almost cried. Not because he was dying, because he was still teaching me, still protecting me, still trying to save my character when everybody else was trying to destroy theirs. I nodded. "I promise, Grandpa." He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. "Good," he said softly. "Then maybe this family still has one honest heart left." 2 days later, he passed away quietly in his sleep. No big speech. No dramatic final breath. Just silence. The house became a cemetery of emotions. Melissa cried the loudest at the funeral. Brandon looked angry the entire time. Thomas acted cold, like he was offended that death had interrupted his plans. But I stood there thinking about Grandpa's last words. Money always reveals character. Now I understood. Because in the middle of grief, money had stripped every fake face clean. After the funeral, the envelope was opened in front of the lawyer. Inside was a letter written by Grandpa in his own hand. It was addressed to the family. The lawyer read it out loud. He wrote that he had seen everything. He wrote that his final years had taught him who was truly loyal and who was only waiting. He wrote that the estate would not be divided by emotion, manipulation, or pressure. He wrote that the people who had tried to exploit his illness would receive nothing beyond what the law required. And then came the final line. "To my family, I leave this reminder. Wealth can be inherited, but integrity must be earned." The room stayed silent after that. Melissa's eyes were wet, but this time her tears looked real. Brandon stared at the floor. Thomas left before the reading ended. And me? I just sat there, holding the letter, feeling like I had been handed both a burden and a lesson. Months passed. The mansion was eventually sold. The foundation Grandpa created began helping schools and hospitals. The legal battles ended. The greedy ones walked away bitter and empty. And the quiet grandson they underestimated became the one carrying forward the only part of the family that actually mattered. Not the money, the lesson. I still think about Grandpa every day, about how a sick old man could see people more clearly than healthy ones ever do, about how wealth brought out the best in some people and the worst in others, about how a room full of family can still feel colder than an empty house. And I remember his voice, calm, tired, truthful. Money always reveals character. It revealed who was loyal. It revealed who was fake. It revealed who loved him. And it revealed who only loved his fortune. So if you ever wonder what people are really like, do not just watch them when life is easy. Watch them when there is something to gain. That is when the truth comes out. That is when masks fall. And that is when money more than anything else, tells the story of who a person truly is. My grandfather knew that before all of us, and now I do too. That is the story I carry. That is the lesson I will never forget. And if this story teaches us anything, it is this: money may build a house, but only character builds a home.